Hello, welcome to the Horti-culturalists. I'm Matthew Lucas.
And I'm Stephen Ryan, and we post a video every week, so why not subscribe and press the alert button.
And Stephen Ryan answers your burning horticultural questions every Monday. So if you've got a question, put it in the comments below and he will answer it in 60 seconds.
I'll do my best.
Do say where you're from, because it does help in the world to contextualise the font of wisdom.
Yes, exactly. Yes, if you come from Saskatchewan, I need to know it.
There you are. Well, Stephen, it is early winter, and let me just say, it is brisk. We have both just been to much warmer climates.
Yes, exactly. Oh dear, yeah, so neither of us are acclimatised to the weather, unfortunately.
But what might be acclimatised?
Oh yes, well, we're going to look at a group of plants today that I've always had a soft spot for. They're one of those groups of plants that I find exceedingly good as garden plants because they have great foliage, they have interesting flowers, they're summer scented, they're bird attractant, and well, actually, what more could you want?
What more do you want
Yes,
other than, I don't know, world peace and the bloodline of Mary Magdalene? But
yes, exactly.
Other than that, what are we talking about?
We're talking about the plants right behind me, which are known, generally speaking, as Mahonia.
We'll get to that and the nomenclature issue in a minute. But Mahonia, all right, well, can we just sort of break it down? Are they all lumped together? What are we actually going to be looking at in this video?
All right, well, they've all got characteristics that are similar. So they do make a quite nice homogeneous sort of cluster of plants, even though the botanists don't agree. There's sort of early flowering ones, which I would call late autumn, early winter bloomers. Yeah. Then there's the proper winter blooming ones, like this one here, but that's also early winter, and then there's late winter. So we've got some that we'll look at that aren't in flower yet, but have interesting foliage and are in the classical mould of yellow flowered Mahonias. And then I've got one in the garden that we need to look at because it's an
outlier.
A renegade almost, and it's summer flowering and it isn't yellow. So we'll have a look at that as well. So it'll give you a sense of the group as a whole.
There you go. Okay, well, let's start. All right, Stephen, let's get into the first tricky subject, the name.
Yes, well, unfortunately, the botanists have decided that Mahonia as a genus probably shouldn't exist anymore, which is probably good because it was named after Bernard McMahon. So it should be Mahnia anyway, if we're going to be specific about it.
We have, Clivia.
Yes, all that stuff. Clivia, Clivia.
Fuchsia, Dahlia.
Yes, it's all too much. And he was a quite famous botanist in his time, and it was named after him by Nuttall, who was probably even a more famous botanist in his time. And so the whole group as a genus has been sunk into the genus Berberis.
Can I just say too, one of the things, we actually made a video about botanic names. We were just talking about it, which I'll link, which I thought was the most tedious subject on earth. But one of the things I like about names is the two types of botanic names I like. One is when the Latin or the Greek gives you an idea about what the plant does, like it creeps, it climbs.
Yes, very useful.
Yeah. But the second thing is the name, if it's named after someone, because you can go down a whole historical rabbit hole and find out, did they find it? Was it named after them? Were they an early growth? So I find that interesting. So when Mr. McMahon is now being buried in horticultural history, in the compost heap of naming, it's a shame.
Well, it is a shame. And of course, it's just inevitable with the work that's being done on DNA and all those other things. So plants are going to change. I still see Mahonia as a group, though, quite distinct from the classical Berberises, even though they're all going to be linked together. And so I'm assuming that the Mahonias as a group will be seen as sort of a subgenus or whatever. So it'll be a group within Berberis. And I have to say, I can sort of see where they're coming from, because if you look at the flower of a Berberis and you sit it next to the flower of a Mahonia, there is basically no difference. The only major differences visually about the two different groups is that Berberises in general have single entire leaves, and there's some deciduous species. Mahonias in general have compound leaves, so they have leaves made up of leaflets, sometimes only a small number, sometimes quite a lot like this one. And so as garden plants, they're quite distinct. So I like to sort of keep them in my head as Mahonia. Anyway.
And Mahonia that we're going to talk about, are they all evergreen?
Oh yes, yes. There's no as far as I know, there's actually no deciduous ones
Okay.
in that group. So they're all evergreen shrubs.
And for the sake of this video, we're referring to these as Mahonia, even though
They're
not.
Berberis,
But look,
yes.
let's with the cunning wizardry of
Oh,
technology
here we go.
spin around,
Walk.
because here is a Berberis.
Yes, and it doesn't look anything
No.
like that yellow flowered shrub on the other side of the driveway.
So to your point, the leaves are single and much smaller,
Yeah.
and this one's deciduous.
Yes, but there's plenty of evergreen Berberis as well. And in fact, we'll look at one later that was actually a hybrid between what was considered to be Berberis and Mahonia. So
Ooh.
I've got in the garden here one I imported years ago, and until comparatively recently when the name changes happened.
But Mahonia.
No, Mahon Bbus, in fact. So it was a cross between Mahonia aquifolium and Berberis sargentii. So they combined the two genus names and they combined the two species names to come up with the hybrid. But of course, that's all not important now because Mahonias are now Berberis. So there you go.
Well, anyway, we won't focus on Berberis because we've done a Berberis epic.
Yes, exactly.
And included this one. So let's go back to that Mahonia and start the video.
All right, what a good idea. All right, we need to discuss this particular plant. There's a group of Mahonias that were bred in England for good hardy garden shrubs. That's what they were looking for. And what they did was they crossed one called Mahonia japonica with one called, at the time,
Where's that from? Talking of botanic
even you
names.
should know that now. And they crossed it with one that was at the time known as Mahonia lomariifolia. Now, lomariifolia means it had leaves that looked like the fern called lomaria. So that's where the name came from. Lomariifolia wasn't considered to be rock hardy in England, but japonica was, but they liked the look of the other one, so they crossed them together to try and get something similar. Now, we can have a look at the other one in a minute, but let's concentrate on this one. So this is one of the hybrids that were bred, and only a few of them came out here to Australia, and I don't quite know how it worked, but there was one called Charity, one called Hope, and then there was one called Leonard Fortescue.
Not Faith.
And then there was one called Buckland, which is this one. And there's a whole range of others. So they were known as Mahonia media forms. So they were a cross between the two species. And they're all good garden plants, although I have to say my soft spot is still for the slightly more tender wild species Lomariifolia, which is now known as Mahonia awakinensis. Sorry.
There we
But what
are.
can I say? So,
But
yes,
it's not Mahonia aquifolium.
no, it's Berberis. But let's,
Anyway,
yeah, and
we're
I'm not
sticking-
even sure they've kept with the species name, so I'd have to look that up. So Buckland is one of the multitude of hybrid Mahonias that was produced to try and get the characteristics of both parents. So the hardiness of japonica and hopefully some of the floral beauty of Mahonia lomariifolia as it was.
And can I say the fragrance? It's a bit like a daffodil.
Yeah, it's quite pleasant. The fragrance of some of the Mahonias is quite lovely. And of course, being winter flowering, they're good plants to use in the garden for their winter colour, but it's also something that the birds can make use of. So the honey eaters and things will come in and sip the nectar from them. So it gives them a food source in the winter. And I'm assuming if you get a warm enough day in the winter when the bees decide to come out for a quick foray, it would also be a useful plant for bees to get nectar and pollen from.
All right, let's talk care. So you were talking about it being hybridized for hardiness. So completely hardy?
Yeah, well, certainly in most of Europe and North America, you would see these media hybrids as being good, hardy garden shrubs, albeit they do need a spot where they're not out in really hot sun.
So I was going to say, in Australia, it's the other end of the spectrum,
Yeah.
heat and sun.
Yeah.
So it needs a bit of protection.
Yeah, I would certainly not plant most of my Mahonias out in full sun because they will in fact bleach. So the leaves will all go yellow and miserable looking. And of course, even if they grow and survive and flower, you need dark green leaves to show off yellow flowers, not yellow leaves to show off yellow flowers.
And it's it's a bright canary yellow. So it's an amazing colour. I mean, it's a pretty overcast, miserable winter day.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
This does leave out. Now, three things.
Yeah.
Soil type.
They're not particularly fussed. It doesn't matter whether it's alkaline or acid, as long as it's reasonably well drained, and they are comparatively drought tolerant once their roots are down.
Berries. So we have spoken about this before. So the berries come in spring, don't
Yes.
they, as the flower cycle ends?
Yeah, so-
which is quite an interesting berry moment in the garden, because you don't really have berries in spring.
No, you don't usually, and therein is another interesting thing, because some of our native birds have taken to them. It gives them a food source, so not the nectar feeding birds, but the berry eating birds, gives them a food source that's out of season. And I have to say, in my many years of experience with Mahonias, I've yet to find a self-sown seedling come up anywhere. So if anybody's worried about the weediness, certainly in Australia, I don't think there's any chance of any of the Mahonias going weedy.
But then on that point, is it easy to propagate?
Most of them are reasonably easy to propagate from cuttings, albeit you need welding gloves to actually do it because the leaves are so prickly. So I always put off putting in my Mahonia cuttings until I'm feeling in that sort of sadomasochistic point in life where I'm
you want to
happy.
Be hurt, Stephen.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. So they're quite difficult to deal with, but they're not that hard to propagate from cuttings. And I might add, not all of the Mahonias are as prickly as some of these ones are.
Now, the last thing is size, which does matter. Now, we were in, it was in a video that unfortunately we had to take down, the Ellis Rowan video. It was a Mahonia that was enormous. It was the size of a maple tree.
Yeah, but that Mahonia was probably 100 years old or more. So in general, I mean, this one's about 25 years old. It's what, metre and a half to 2 metres. It's probably a little wider than it is tall. I've never pruned it. I've never done anything to it. It's just sitting there on the corner doing its thing. Whereas some of the others are larger, and there's a number of quite small ones.
So slow growing then, I'm assuming?
Yeah, they normally send up one shoot a year, and when they're well established, it might be 20 centimetres or 7 or 8 inches, something like that a year. And in fact, if you go back through this plant, you can see its yearly growth pattern, because that's how much it put on last year after flowering.
Yeah.
So it will put on about the same this year after flowering.
Okay.
So not big.
Now, I also thought that they were much more sort of perpendicular, but this is quite spready shrubby.
Yes, well, it is in fact, and that's part of the interesting thing about the breeding. The shape of the plants of these Mahonia media types hark back to Japonica, which is a much broader, spreadier sort of bush.
Right.
But there are a number of much more vertical Mahonias as well.
Okay, which are great for smaller spaces, which I might need.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned that the species parent, one of them is over there. So
Yes.
should we go and look at that now?
I think we should.
Okay.
All right, Matthew, here we are standing in front of my house and my what was Mahonia lomariifolia.
Yep.
It's now, well, Mahonia awakinensis, which is really hard to say, and of course now it's Berberis as well, but anyhow, it's one of the premier species in lots of different ways. Its foliage is really long, so it's very dramatic. It has a comparatively upright form, which I quite like, and certainly it's great from the perspective of garden usage. It can get quite tall. This plant's actually been pruned back about 12 months ago. I could actually look out the upstairs window at the flowers until comparatively recently.
And how old is it though?
It was planted about 1986 or 7.
So not a pressing problem in terms of its growth?
No, exactly. And they are very prunable, which is something people should be aware of.
All of them?
Yeah, you can pretty well prune any Mahonia as hard as you like, and it will come back again. And in fact, I had one of these lomariifolias at the nursery. Well, no, I still have. And I decided I'd try and shift it because it was growing up against the base of another tree and it was all getting a little tangled. And I thought, well, the only way I'm going to shift it is to cut it back hard because otherwise I'd have to tangle with all those prickly leaves. So I cut it down to a stump, and I thought I'll just dig the stump out and move it. Of course, I started digging and I couldn't get it out because the roots of the tree were all in there as well. And so I gave up, and the Mahonia has come back again and is probably every bit as big as it originally was. So yes, you can prune them and shape them and do what you want with them. I took the top off this one mainly because the possums and other things have been having a bit of a go at it, and it was looking a bit thin and wispy on the top. So now it's refurbished itself and it looks absolutely fabulous.
Now, we mentioned with the other one, Mahonia japonica, obviously from Japan, but there are North American ones. So what's the range of the species?
Well, there's sort of two hot spots. There's Asia, so all through Japan, China, probably down into Korea and so forth.
And cooler, so not tropical.
Not tropical. And then there's the North American species, and they extend down to a few species in sort of Mexico down into Central America. So, so it extends through that part of the world. And in fact, one of them that we'll have a look at later, aquifolium, when it was first discovered, it was bringing huge prices in England because it was a great plant to plant on your grand estate for pheasant cover and food. And they were paying sort of guineas a plant for it way back 200 years ago. So, so there's those two different groups, and there's some crossover in similarities, but the foliagey ones, the really bold, big foliagey ones, all tend to be Asian ones.
Right. And are they all, so what kind of conditions are they found in? Are they all sort of understory shrub, mostly?
In general, yeah. So most of the Mahonias are plants that grow best where they've got semi to full shade. They certainly don't like a lot of hot afternoon sun on them. There's one or two from Mexico that will actually grow out in fairly open sunny aspects, but they have quite tiny little leaves and are not, well, they're not unattractive, but they're not as boldly attractive as some of the Asian ones.
Yeah.
Of course, another thing that I find really interesting with this particular Mahonia, although some of the others do it a bit as well, because this one's quite tall and becomes almost tree-like, it also produces quite heavy stems, and I think its fissured bark is also a feature of the plant. So it's just another little side issue that people should consider when planting Mahonia awakinensis.
The flowers of this look a little bit like heather. The way they're standing up.
Yes, it is. And that's one of the characteristics of this particular species that is quite desirable, I think, the way the flowers stand up like candles all over the plant. And it's not translated into most of the hybrids, I find. Nearly all of the hybrids tend to have the more droopy flower spikes. Still lovely, but I do like this upright form of this.
But I guess the droopy ones, because what we haven't spoken about is the berries. We talked about them, but their colour is like burnished grape, but they're small, but the colour is sensational.
Yeah, they're a bluey black with a slightly whitish bloom on them like grapes often have. I do find with this, when that gets its berries on it, the stems actually do tend to hang over a bit. They don't tend to be as quite rigidly upright because I think of the weight of the berries.
Right. It's beautiful. And so this one is an Asian species.
Yep. So it was the two Asian species, or two of the Asian species crossed together, that produced the media forms.
The first one. All right, so we're going to look at something else now.
Yes, let's go and have a look at another one.
Okay, next.
All right. Well, this one is another media form, so Mahonia media, and it's just about finished flowering now. It had some quite lovely flowers on it sort of in the late autumn, early winter, and it was bred by a friend of mine in Tasmania, Ken Gillanders. He had a fabulous nursery down there called Woodbank Nursery, and I can remember as a child buying plants from Ken. I'd wait for his catalogue to arrive, and then I would lock myself away for a while, putting asterisks next to everything I wanted to buy, and then I'd get sensible and say I can't afford all of that, and I'd buy a few things.
How old were you when you're doing this?
Probably 16, 17, something like that. And so Ken was in the trade for donkey's years. He only closed his nursery a few years ago. He's still with us. He's in his 80s and he lives in Tasmania. And he imported an enormous amount of fabulous plant material before quarantine got so difficult that it's made it almost impossible. And he also did some of his own breeding, and this is one of his. And funnily enough, this Mahonia he has called woodbank. And I don't know whether anybody's still propagating it commercially or not. In fact, I should. But I think woodbank is a great one. It's got slightly broader foliage than awakinensis, slightly narrower foliage than Buckland, and it has quite long sprays of yellow flowers, and it flowers that little bit earlier than the other two.
Right. But otherwise, though, same berries,
same sort of, yes, basic format, bright yellow flowers.
Good
it also
bark.
makes, yes, it's got the good bark of Mahonia awakinensis, and it makes quite a substantial bush. This one would be the same age as my Buckland over there, and it's probably half as big again.
So you can get quite a length of flowering period then if you have an early flower and the more normal flower. And the flowers are scented as well?
Yes, nicely scented. And I think actually the flower sprays, although you can't see it now that it's finished, but I think they're even longer than the ones on Buckland.
Wow.
So I now have some reservations as to whether I should have planted them in the other direction, because the Buckland's in a very prominent spot in the garden. This one's a bit hidden away. But nonetheless, you can't have everything out in prime spots, and it's nice to have something special where you've got to go and look for it.
Well, you have, and it's on a path, so you do discover it, which is beautiful. All right, on to the next.
All right. Now this one is another one of the Asian Mahonias. This one's called Mahonia bealei, and it's a later winter flowering one, so it's just starting to get its first flowers opening. The flower spikes tend to come out and almost hang down once they're fully open, and it's a very pale lemon yellow, so it's much paler than the other ones we've been looking at. But I like bealei for its big, broad leaflets, so it's quite a dramatic shrub. It doesn't have as many leaflets per leaf as some of the other species, but they're big, they're broad, and they're slightly sort of grey-green. And it also has a quite upright habit, so it doesn't take up a lot of space. So bealei is definitely worth considering for a slightly later flowering one.
All right, what is before us? We'll get to the plastic.
Yes, not the most attractive thing in the garden, but anyhow, the Mahonia we're looking at, which is this one right in front of us, is one of the North American species, and it comes from Western Canada right down into California, and it's commonly known as the Oregon grape, because it gets little grape-like berries, like a lot of the Mahonias. Yeah. And this is the one that bought huge amounts of money when it first came into England, because it's a suckering shrub, so you end up with this sort of drift of it.
A thicket.
A thicket, yes, which is great for your pheasants and partridges to disappear under, as well as giving them food. And if it gets a bit of light on it, this one gets wonderful winter colours in the foliage, so you've got this fabulous reddish colour in it.
Yeah.
And this is a selected form. Of course, me being me, I've got to have the selected form. And it's a selected one called Moseri. So its yellow flowers will come out in the late winter, and they're shortish spikes of yellow flowers.
And they're just starting to emerge.
Yeah, they're just starting to come out. It won't be long. But when the new growth comes on this plant after flowering in the spring, the new foliage is bright orange.
Wow.
And so it's quite spectacular when it first comes out into,
so you got
into new growth.
4 things: autumn foliage, spring foliage, flowers, berries.
Yes. What more could you want?
What more? And a pheasant cover.
And a pheasant cover, which we all need, of course.
I do. I'm living for that.
Yes.
Now, can we just allude to...
Oh, yes, the plastic.
Because we are now in full sun.
Yeah, we are. A lot of the North American Mahonias will cope with a lot more sun. Yeah. And in fact, in the winter, if they're in an open aspect, their winter colour when the frost hits them is often more intense.
Yeah.
This was a little bit shadier though, and the reason it's not is because I had a lime tree growing here, a Tahitian lime, which died last year for reasons I still haven't figured out. I think it was several La Nina seasons where it just got too wet and cold during the summer when it should have been warm. And so we've just planted a young, well, about 6 months ago, planted a young lime in its place, and that little bit of plastic is to try and protect the plant from the cold for this first winter, just to get it through. So I'm hoping it will do its job. We haven't had a proper frost yet, so time will tell.
So I guess then, as an understory plant, it will be in deciduous forest, so it would get more light in winter, hence the colouring.
It probably would, and of course they have a more intense cold than we even get too, so the cold would get into the ground. So if you're going to plant aquifolium in any of its forms, it doesn't get very tall, it gets up to about waist height or a little more, but it does sucker quite profusely. So this one started somewhere sort of just over the other side of the lime tree, and it has worked its way all through the garden bed here, and I'm perfectly happy for it to do that, but some people might find its lack of constraint something of a problem.
Problematic.
Yes. All right, now another thing that's going on in this bed is in fact another Mahonia.
Aha.
And I've got some of it down here, and it's actually popping up all the way through the Mahonia aquifolium. And it's another North American species called nervosa, has basically the same sort of growth habit.
Now, back to our Latin name thing, what does nervosa indicate?
It's got to do with the nerves of the leaves, I think.
Oh, okay.
So it's got a slightly more nerve-showing leaf, if that makes any sense. I'm going to have to look it up to be sure. I've probably made a mistake. But anyhow, this one also gets the classical yellow flowers. Tends to be late winter when it blooms. And when the cold hits it in the winter, the foliage tends to go more a burgundy shade. So with the aquifolium and it growing in the bed together, it actually works quite well.
And an observation though, so this one is well in bud. This one hasn't really begun to bud yet, so it will be even later. So you will get successive flowering.
You will. So I will get yellow flowers in here over a longer period than I would have otherwise. And I guess because I've put 2 suckering thugs in the same bed together.
They're being thuggish together.
They're being thuggish together, so in a sense they're not taking up any more room than the one would have in the first place. So I guess it sort of works, but it wasn't something I'd sort of intentionally done. And I still to this day don't quite know why I planted 2 Mahonias of a similar form in the one bed next to each other.
A moment of madness, Stephen.
It probably was.
I do love this foliage right now. It's beautiful.
Oh, it is. It's gorgeous.
Scarlet.
I think they're well worthwhile planting in the garden.
But hang on, it's not deciduous. The leaves just turn colour.
Yeah, and in fact they'll go back to green in the summer. So the colour will change back once the warmer weather comes on, and in the meantime, of course, you'll get the orange new growth.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
It's sort of a chameleon.
Yes, it
All right.
is.
Well, I think we've got one more to look at.
Yes, let's go find
You
it.
sound hesitant.
Well,
Let's
I was
go.
just thinking there might be something else we find on the way. You never know in my garden,
Okay.
so let's see.
Well, there was something on the way to the last one.
Yeah.
This isn't the last one.
I told you so. This is actually one I imported years ago from England, and at the time it was considered to be a hybrid between a Berberis and a Mahonia.
Yeah.
And it was called Mahonia Berberis. And it was a cross between aquifolium, which was the North American one that we saw in the garden before.
Yeah.
So a cross between aquifolium and one of the Berberises called Berberis sargentiana. And so it was Mahonia Berberis sargentiana. Now, because the two genera have been put together, we can just call this Berberis. But it still would be classed as a sort of a hybrid of the Mahonia group.
Yeah.
And it's really intriguing because some of its leaves look like really spiky holly leaves.
Holly, I was going to say, does
Yeah.
not look
Yeah.
like a Mahonia or a Berberis.
But other leaves within the plant are almost thornless. So you look at that and that's just got serrated edges to it.
And that looks more like a canomeles.
Anomalies. Yeah, I guess it does a bit, yeah. But if you can look at those two different leaf forms, they
Wow.
look quite different, but they're all, both on the one plant.
And is one older, younger, or is it?
No, it just seems to be different growth that comes up. I think there's the chance that it's sort of almost throwing back to the different parents in some sort of weird way.
'Cause
So there you go.
In our Holly Epic, which I'll link, one of the points you make is as that plant gets taller, it loses its spikiness,
Yeah.
but that's not what's happening
No,
here.
this doesn't seem to be what's happening here because it throws branches of both. So you
At
can
the same
never
height.
Yeah, at the same height and in a random sort of a way.
So this one isn't in bloom now. When does it flower?
This one's a comparatively late winter bloomer,
Right.
and it has quite short flower spikes in clusters, a bit like the aquifolium has. Yeah, in fact, in bloom you'd hardly tell them apart, but it's probably a bit later flowering.
And the buds haven't even yet formed.
No,
so
there's no sign of any flower buds in it at the moment, but it may not even flower this year, who knows, but it is later blooming.
But the thing is, though, what we've demonstrated is you can get successive Mahonias throughout the late autumn all the way through winter to spring.
Yes. But there is more. We have one I want to engage with, the last one, which is completely out of sync with the rest of the Mahonias as a group, at least in my experience. I'm always prepared to be surprised by a new discovery, but let's have a look at the very last one we're going to have in our Mahonia epic.
Okay. Final lucky last.
Yes, all right. This one is something of a special plant as far as my garden's concerned. This one is Mahonia Gracilipes. It's another one of the Asian species.
Gracilipes?
Yes, and it does quite a few things that are different. One, its leaves are completely thornless.
They are, and they also look completely different.
Yeah. The other thing about them is too, the reverse of the
Oh.
leaf is silvery. So you've got this lovely silvery reverse on the leaf. But it doesn't stop there.
But wait,
Yes.
there's more.
In high summer, its flowers form instead of in autumn, winter, or even into spring.
Yeah.
So it's a high summer flower, and the flowers are soft pink. So it's completely out of whack colour-wise with virtually the rest of the genus.
Wow.
I mean, there's some that verge into the oranges, but there's certainly not many species that could pretend to be pink.
No.
So Gracilipes is quite a rarity. It's quite rare and hard to get in Europe and North America, mainly because it's quite slow growing and therefore it takes ages to propagate. This plant is probably 10 or 15 years old already, and I've managed to propagate a very tiny number from my plant, and I'll be working on it again in due course.
And he doesn't have any in stock, so don't ask.
Yeah, don't ask for any at this stage. And of course, because it's summer flowering, it fruits at a different time of the year. And I just found 2 berries, and oops, they're just little purpley black berries. And I'm going to hang on to these because there might be some seed in them.
Ah, that
So,
might be an easy
yeah.
way to do it.
Yeah.
Now, given it's so different, this is Asiatic.
Yeah.
Is it from a very different climate or area to the other ones?
I don't think so. It's still sort
So
of
it's not
from
like
that.
subtropical and it's doing a different thing.
Yeah, not particularly. I must look it up, but I think it's still basically China, maybe down into northern Myanmar, Thailand, sort of all those sort of areas. And I just think it's developed in a slightly different way to some of the other species. So, and it was only imported into Western horticulture only a few decades ago too. So it hasn't become generally well known, but I know there's a few specialist growers you could probably get it from in England or North America, and I definitely look out for it. It seems to be pretty hardy. I saw it growing when I was at the Van Dusen Botanic Gardens in Vancouver. It was growing there, so it will cope with quite cold conditions. I think it will cope with reasonably warm conditions as well. But like most of the Mahonias, semi to full shade is a good thing. And this one's actually growing under a huge old eucalypt, and I hardly give it water specifically. And I think the only challenge it's had in life, when it was a little tiny plant about that big and I planted it, a lady in the garden fell on it. When the garden was open one day, I nearly had a heart attack myself. Of all the things she could have fallen on in my garden, the one and only in Australia, she managed to trip over and fall on it.
Your first concern was the plant.
Yes, exactly. Yes, sorry, but there you go. It was my first concern. I did help her up, and I was very
But
caring.
off the plant.
Yeah, but off the plant, yes. And fortunately, she didn't snap it, but she pushed it over onto the ground, so I had to stake it up for a while before it could get its act back together again.
That is hilarious.
Yeah,
But anyway, she was fine.
Yeah.
The plant was fine.
Yeah. So
Well,
there you go.
Stephen, what a wonderful romp through Mahonias, which are no longer Mahonias.
Yes, exactly. So I think they're one of those groups of plants that the term Mahonia is going to stick with them for a long time, because I think people are resistant to this change.
Yeah.
But I can sort of understand where it's come from, and I don't like it, but I'll agree with it.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if you want to know what we're doing next week, you'll have to hit subscribe.
Yes, so please do. And don't forget our Monday shorts. So if you've got a question for me, put it in the comment section below. Tell me where you're from, and we'll hopefully get round to answering your questions in due course.
We will indeed. But until then, we'll see you next Friday.
All right, bye all.